Hey guys, so if you have been checking the front page of distrowatch.com lately, you may have noticed that there is a release candidate available for Linux Mint 17, one of my all-time favorite distributions, or at least, well, the 17th in a line of one of my favorite distributions. And today I'm going to be giving you a first impressions review. So without further adu, let's get started. So what I've done here is that I've booted up into the live CD, and I'm just about to start Linux Mint from the boot menu there. So Linux Mint, like I say, is the first distribution I used that I really truly felt comfortable with. Before Linux Mint, I'd used, started off with SUSE, then went with Fedora, then Ubuntu, and then Linux Mint. And this was back in the day when the multimedia codecs weren't really that readily available, and Linux Mint was kind of revolutionary in its that it actually included the ability to play DVDs out of the box, that it could play MP3s out of the box, and all this kind of stuff. And it really made life a lot easier for me as a Linux newbie. Even though I'd tried 3 distributions before it, it was still the first one that I really felt comfortable and you know, yeah, comfortable with. Okay, so I'm going to have to quickly switch over my display here, just to just because now it's entered a sort of a more graphical state, so I've just had to change my recording software there. So Linux Mint comes bundled with quite a lot of software, but it comes in a 1.2 gigabyte download. So it comes with Firefox web browser as default, HexChat, which is your IRC client. If you don't know what that is, it's essentially a way for you to talk with the rest of the Linux community if you need any kind of help or support or anything like that. Pigeon Instant Messenger you can use to chat over AOL, Google Talk, Jabber, Yahoo, MSN. It gives you LibreOffice as your default Office package. Now, nowadays, most people who use, or a lot of people, will sort of go more towards the cloud applications. Like Microsoft have moved a lot of their Office software to the cloud. The Google Docs is actually pretty good, and I kind of have a feeling that as a digital society, we are moving more towards the cloud. But LibreOffice is there should you require it. It gives you your standard, gives you a band sheet to organize your music collection. Then it gives you all the preferences in a very easy and straightforward menu, unlike Ubuntu, which just has icons up the wall. I can never really get to grips with the Unity interface. Anyway, let's try the install process, because to me that is a benchmark of how user-friendly distribution is. And Linux Mint is designed to be user-friendly. So, so for those of you that want a bit of context as to what Linux Mint is as a distribution, it's based on Ubuntu. And Ubuntu is probably the most well-known and at least media-savvy Linux distribution out there. But it isn't the highest-ranking one on distrowatch.com. That actually does go to our friend Linux Mint here as the most popular one. And there are a few nuances and perhaps reasons based on that, not necessarily just because of flat-out popularity. So yeah, like I say, this is definitely based around user-friendliness, and what it does is it essentially takes Ubuntu and it grounds it. It says, hang on a minute, maybe you don't want these fancy interfaces, maybe you don't want the icons up the side of the screen, or however they want to change up their user interface. Maybe they want something that's a bit more familiar to a Windows user, or, well, familiar to anyone. And that's what Cinnamon is based on. So I'm trialing out the Cinnamon version here, but it comes in 2 main flavors. I'll log in automatically just because this is a virtual machine. It comes in Cinnamon and it comes in Mate. These are 2 different desktop environments, and to be honest, I gotta say, the big one, it's a bit of a fault, actually, in my opinion, that Linux Mint tries to peddle it with both versions of their operating system, with Mate and with Cinnamon, right off the bat. With the press release, it included both the Mate version and the Cinnamon version, 2 different desktop interfaces that are actually quite similar and both reasonably user-friendly to use. So, you know, I don't even, I don't know why they're insistent on having both. I mean, it would be nice if they picked one and just went with it. Maybe Cinnamon, because Cinnamon is a shell for GNOME 3. So there's a lot of, there's a big community already behind a large chunk of the software that they're using for their desktop interface. But yeah, this is definitely the easiest distribution to move over, and I have sometimes in the past criticized Linux Mint for not being corporate friendly enough or proprietary friendly enough. And what I mean by that is that it's a very community oriented distribution, and there are some amazing positives to that. They listen to the community, they take on feedback from the community, and they communicate with the community really, really, really well. A star for that. But it is very settled in the Linux world, when it can perhaps gain a little more potential if it appealed more to Windows users by being a little more friendly to proprietary software, by being a bit more friendly to having options to buy applications for it. Now, it's obviously compatible with Steam, which is, to me, it's an important factor, but Steam's compatible with a lot of distributions nowadays. So you can buy games for it, and you can, I'm sure in time, buy applications through Steam for Linux as well. You can certainly do that for Windows. But Ubuntu have tried to bring in an app store, and they haven't done a particularly good job at it, but it would be nice if there were some way that you could actually sell software on Linux, that Linux could perhaps be a platform for independent software developers that are actually looking to make a living rather than just to give away their software for free. And yeah, I know that with open source there are ways that you can monetize it, ways that you can earn a living off of it without actually having to make it proprietary or anything. But to me, Linux is about choice. Different types of software, different ways of using software, different choices in what software that you're going to use at all. And it would be nice if there were some choices for proprietary as well as some choices for open source. Because some software works better as proprietary, some software works better as open source. For example, games, are naturally proprietary pieces of software because games have a life cycle. You might get bored of a game after 2 months and therefore might want to go back to the well and buy another one. Whereas with open source games, with open source software, if you have a problem and you will develop a piece of software to solve said problem, then once you've developed that open source environment, because there's no necessary incentive to actually have to keep reinventing that program just to make more money to sell more units. Problem is solved, job done. Whereas with a lot of software you might find in the proprietary world with Windows is that they might develop a word processor, but they might have to keep reinventing that word processor to keep selling more versions of it. So some software does work naturally as open source very, very well, and some software does work quite well, in my opinion, as proprietary. And it would be nice to mix and match, have a bit of both. And Linux is, as a whole group of distributions, is moving towards that, and I think that's going to be what eventually pushes it as a more widely used distribution than Windows. And I believe it will do in time. Might take a while, but Windows is sliding, and it's moving to the cloud as well. I mean, we could very well see that Windows might very well be a cloud-based operating system in 5 years' time. But then we're getting into the realms of speculation here. So going back to Linux Mint, yeah, it's the grounded version of Ubuntu. A lot of people say that it's Ubuntu done right, and I kind of agree with that 99 times out of 100. It's straightforward. It's got very simple, straightforward user interfaces. It's similar to Windows, but without actually having to take on the flaws of Windows. The software that comes bundled with it is actually pretty good. Now, I don't usually put too much stock in the software that's bundled with a distribution because it's just so easy to install software through Linux that it's a secondary issue. In fact, I would be more happy actually if a lot of distributions came as a, say, 200 megabyte install download, and then you actually chose your software as part of the install process, like some of the Debian installers do. Because nowadays a lot of people, just as an option, not necessarily even as their flagship download, but as far as Linux Mint goes, and the software that it does choose in its 1.2 gigabyte download, it makes some good choices with software. Can't deny that. The best choices. Actually, I think the software that's bundled with Linux Mint is probably the best bundle that you will get. So, so not too bad there. They could possibly squeeze that down into a 700 megabyte download to fit onto a CD rather than a DVD. But I think nowadays CDs are, the difference is kind of negligible, maybe. I mean, I've got a pretty slow internet connection, and I don't have a problem downloading 1.2 gigabytes. So I should be okay. But there you go. I mean, Linux and Linux Mint, to me at least, want to appear accessible, and they are. So good on them for that. But yeah, I mean, Ubuntu have this habit of just making dramatic changes to their user interface or how their software works, and I quite like reading the Ubuntu press releases because there's usually some interesting surprises in there. But with Linux Mint, it's almost just, it's been the same distribution as it has for a good number of years now, and that's a good thing. Because like I say, with open source, you don't need to keep reinventing the wheel and adding shiny new gadgets that no one's going to use to keep selling new units. You can have like an evolving piece of software that evolves either slowly over time or even not at all. If you've solved the problem, you don't need to keep resolving it, and that's a pretty good philosophy to have. And Linux Mint do take the philosophy of if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and they do. Do we really need these language packs? We skip them. I don't know. Yes, there we go. So this is the release candidate. So it's not the final release. It's more stable than beta, less stable than a final release. And I don't usually, even though I have done on this channel before, I don't like to test run beta distributions because it's really not a final final product. And I will give them very much the benefit of the doubt if it's a beta, and because unlike early access on Steam, we're not paying for a distribution here. So it's not a lot to ask of a community to do a bit of beta testing if they're getting a free operating system out of the mix. But with the release candidate of Linux Mint, in every time I've used the release candidate for Linux Mint, it's been as stable as the final distribution, because it is based on the latest release of Ubuntu, which is stable. So it's about as stable as a non-release or pre-release version of software is going to get. So I certainly think that this is a good reflection of what we have in store. But like I say, I was running Linux Mint 13, which is the long-term support release, which I believe this is also a long-term support release. And it's almost indistinguishable from it. The theme's practically indistinguishable from it. The software bundle's practically indistinguishable from it. And, they made a lot of right decisions very early on. So more power to them on that one. But it's really just updating the versions of the software. There might be some more features on some of the actual software, updating the repositories, the software in the libraries, updating drivers and the default drivers that come bundled with it, but really it's the same old Linux Mint by the looks of it, just on the surface here, that we all know and love. And you got to admit, Linux Mint knows its strengths. It knows how to play to them, and you got to give them credit for that. Like I say, though, we are still in the install process at the moment, but the same Linux Mint have been releasing the same distribution for the past 4 or 5 years, really. The first distributions that Linux Mint were released, they were still finding their feet, but they're well and truly established as a distribution now. And they were was it PC Linux magazine? One of the magazines, it was christened the distribution of 2013, and rightfully so, which was Linux Mint 16, if I'm not mistaken. So like I said, yeah, Linux Mint, generally pretty fine distribution. It comes with a decent amount of eye candy. It looks quite nice. Possibly not the nicest looking distribution out there, and you can certainly add a few tweaks to make it look quite nice. But again, most people don't want to overdo it on the bells and whistles. A nice bit of shine it's almost required in Linux distributions, because Linux distributions still have something to prove to the wider digital world, and that's that they're user-friendly, they can be used as a mainstream distribution, that they have that degree of popular appeal. And a little bit of eye candy is kind of required for that. So anyway, let's restart. Let's see whether or not we're going to have any problems booting up, and what the system's like once it's up and running. So you're probably not going to be able to see too much here. Switch over to my my monitor input. So I don't really know what to expect at this point. I obviously tested the live CD before showing you guys, but I didn't actually test the final install process, because I do tend to like to do these things blind. So here we go. So I'm not actually expecting any surprises here, because Linux Mint doesn't really do surprises, does it? So it comes bundled with the MP3, the ability to play MP3s, the ability to play DVDs out of the box. It comes with, I do believe, a version of Java. The only thing I don't think it comes bundled with by default, and like I said, this could be different with this release, is that I don't think it comes bundled with the ability to encode in high def formats. But that's just a package that you might need to install. It's not a particularly laborious task. So also, this isn't really a true reflection of the boot up time either, because like I say, this is a virtual machine, which is not an actual physical computer, which will actually run this a lot more smoother and a lot faster. So what have we got here? We've got the welcome screen, which actually looks very nice, very polished. Gives you a user guide, important information. Okay, that was a bit funky. Yeah. Okay, so what that was just my my recording software just adjusting to the graphics of this. Okay, so this is Qiana. Is that how you pronounce it? 17. So it gives you, yeah, this is the press release that it comes up. Known issues: login screen freezes for German-speaking users. NVIDIA Optimus cards do not work yet. So they want some testers on that. But yeah, no, fundamentally speaking, the issues by and large with Linux Mint are few and far between. Gives you some tutorials, sponsors, donations. Tutorials by format. They got some essentials there. The ideas pool. So yeah, Linux Mint as a development community, very good at listening to their users, and you've got to give them credit to that, because if you look at Ubuntu, they're pretty damn terrible. They do their own thing, and there sometimes is good reason for that. Sometimes that Ubuntu run by Canonical is it has a profit motive, and it needs to put food on the table for its employees at the end of the day. I believe Linux Mint, last time I was reading, have 2 full-time employees, but I could very well be wrong on that one. They have a very small team, but then they are building on top of the Ubuntu base, so there we go. And like I say, they are very good at listening to their user base, and that's something we could really see more of. Okay, so the accessories, the graphics come with the GIMP image editor. Come comes with Firefox, as you saw, that was open previously. So yeah, it's got a good software bundle, the best software bundle out of any distribution, really. And again, I think that's just really simply as a result of listening to their user base. A lot of distributions put the software that they either that they think people want without actually listening to them, or the software that that the developers personally want. Or sometimes they just put just software in without thinking about it sort of too much, just as a filler up to the CD possibly. So anyway, yeah, you can drag the windows to not maximize, make them fit half the screen, I think. Quarter of the screen, that's pretty nifty. You can divide up the screen quite easily, which is nice. Okay, so anyway, I don't really want to spend too much time looking at the GIMP, as you guys are probably well aware of its quality as a image manipulation tool, Photoshop. Personally, I like it. A lot of people do have problems with the user interface, but to each his own there. Okay, so it's quite well known for having a very good update manager. It has been criticized by the developers of Ubuntu, but then again, there's some degree of incentive in criticizing that. So Linux Mint takes stability very, very seriously in their distributions, and this is part of the reason why is that each of these upgrades has been given a ranking 1 to 5. 1 being the most stable and 5 being the least stable. So I think it even gives you, yeah, it gives you the information here, does it? View, history of updates, preferences. I think it probably, yeah, here we go. So when it comes to upgrading all the various software packages in Linux Mint, it's actually really good at classifying them. So, for example, all these are optional updates that you can install. So the description here is if it's a level 1 description, it's a certified package tested through Romeo or directly maintained by Linux Mint. And then number 2, recommended packages tested and approved by Linux Mint upstream means that it comes from behind Linux Mint. So in this case, it's either Ubuntu or what Ubuntu is based on, which is Debian. And it's been tested as well, which means, well, it's been tested. So 3 is safe packages not tested but believed to be safe. So these are ones that have been pretty well established on the Ubuntu repositories. And then 4 is unsafe packages could potentially affect the stability of the system. Dangerous packages known to affect the stability of the systems depending on certain specs of hardware. Now 4 and 5 don't necessarily mean that it's like malicious software, or that it's a dangerous, well, it says it's dangerous here, but usually what this means is that it's the type of upgrade which, if done badly or if done poorly or if done in the wrong circumstances, could quite sorely corrupt your system, which would cause a lot of ache for you to have to try and fix it again, when you might not necessarily have to, when it's an update that's not really that important. So it only advises you to do these 3 off the bat. But yeah, 1 to 3 is generally considered what people update as. And then this tells you what type. Now this is new to me, I think, but then again, my last version of Linux Mint was 13. So this is a package update which updates a piece of software that you might use. So it might give you a new feature, it might correct a bug, or it might, but something to do with your software. So for example, like the Firefox or GIMP that we were looking at a little bit earlier. And then the red exclamation mark is a security update, which means that it just improves or fortifies the security of your system by the looks of it. Security updates, of course, pretty damn important, but it's nice that they actually classify it and sort of let you know. Although sometimes you could argue that they're kind of there's some overlap here with, for example, with Firefox. It might give you a new feature, it might improve the security. But anyway, that's the update, which again, Linux Mint tool that has been pretty well received, because now that Ubuntu actually include a lot of the proprietary codecs like MP3s, and even I think there might be the ability to play back DVDs included in even in its initial install, if I'm not mistaken. There's certainly a lot of proprietary codecs in Ubuntu's initial install, and that's made it a lot easier for people who are new to Linux, who don't really know what codecs even are. But Linux Mint has actually found a way to survive, even though Ubuntu have brought in the feature that Linux Mint was originally conceived to correct. So that's pretty cool. And again, and Linux Mint has made a name for itself, not being as crazy as Ubuntu. So, what other Mint tools are there? There's a few, isn't there? There's the software upload manager. Software manager, that's the one I was thinking of. So the software manager here is how you can install new pieces of software. Again, it was originally conceived because the Ubuntu software installer just wasn't really that great at the time. It's certainly, the Ubuntu one has improved a lot in recent years, but that hasn't stopped the Linux Mint team from actually developing their own. Those black flashes, I'm going to assume, are actually from the virtual machine and the graphics, being generated rather than the actual distribution itself. So I wouldn't take that as a particular warning or as something that would happen to you there. So anyway, you can have a look at games. I'll just pick games out of the way because I usually like to see how Linux distributions have advanced in the games department. Not really. We've still got Wine, we've got Wesnoth, we've got Super Tux Kart, Warzone. So these are all, for all intents and purposes, pretty the same old mediocre games that we are kind of used to. Can we actually pick up Steam? Yeah. So you can install the Steam launcher here, which for some reason only has 4 stars out of 5, which is a bit of a crime because it's the best thing to ever happen in Linux in the last couple of years. But yeah, you can install the Steam launcher, and you can get Steam up and running. And it's as easy as just sort of double clicking and installing away, really. But it does take a while, so that's a thing there. So there are a handful of other Linux Mint tools which you can actually kind of pick up, but they're all pretty good. They're all improvements on what Ubuntu has to offer. So, just as a bit of a quick summary, then I gotta say, I'm about as impressed with Linux Mint as I always am when a new distribution comes out, which is to say, pretty darn impressed. You're never really wowed by a Linux Mint distribution because they never make these radical and massive changes that Ubuntu tend to. But that's definitely a good thing from the Linux Mint developers. They know what people want. They know what people sort of are looking for in an operating system. They know very well the software bundles that that should really go with their operating system. And a lot of that is down to just listening to people. And I think as a distribution, they are very, very, very good at listening to their user base, and they keep you very informed with blogs, and the Linux Mint website is actually very, very, very well maintained. And it shows, and it really does show. So if you're looking for an operating system where you kind of want to feel a little bit of a connection to the people who are actually making it, you want them to actually sort of listen to you, and if you want something which is a little more conservative, a little more straightforward, a little more has a little more of a stable attitude that takes stability very, very, very seriously, actually, again, to their credit, then this is definitely a distribution you might want to look into. It's also a no aggro distribution. It's install and go. It's as simple as that. It installs the codecs, it installs a good software bundle, you can just put it on your system, and you can kind of just pick it up and use it. I mean, I am personally a big fan of LXDE, and I like LXDE as a desktop environment because it's pretty much identical to Windows 95, which is, to me, the day when we actually worked out the best user interface. and I don't mind the funky panels that they've put in here. It works well. The search feature works well. The quick links on the side, they work well. And when I do install Linux Mint, I do keep the Cinnamon desktop environment actually, rather than switching to LXDE, because it's similar enough and good enough looking that I'm happy to have it on my system. So yeah, the guys at Linux Mint really do know what they're doing when it comes to an operating system. I can't really sing their praises highly enough. Only one tiny criticism, and it is a tiny criticism, that I have with Linux Mint, is that they release both Mate and Cinnamon at the same time, and they don't really make it clear the distinction between them, which can be pretty confusing to new users. I mean, new users aren't going to know what a desktop environment is. They're not going to know what the difference between Cinnamon and Mate is. They're not going to care that Mate is a fork of GNOME 2.0, whereas Cinnamon is a shell for GNOME 3. Yeah, so I think that if they had a single flagship distribution like they used to have, that would be a lot more accommodating to people who were switching from Windows. I think that it would be also, again, would be more accommodating to Windows users if the drive partitioning was a little more straightforward. It's not too bad if you want to wipe the entire hard disk and then put Linux on there, but it would be interesting if there was a straightforward user-friendly way to put your home partition on a separate partition, something which Windows users might not understand is as important as it actually is, because there is no default to put your home folder on a separate partition, and you have to do it through the actual partition manager, which is user-friendly, but possibly not to your average Windows XP to Linux Mint convert. But then again, that's a criticism I can carry across to just about any distribution out there. But it would be nice to see the ability to divide your hard disk up with home as a separate partition. Just because, just as a sort of a, not even necessarily as, well, yeah, maybe as a default, as a default option, but again, that's well, I say it's a small thing. The thing is, when Linux Mint upgrades, or the standard upgrade procedure for Linux Mint is a reinstall. It's to wipe everything clean and to reinstall. So if you do not have your home folder on a separate partition, then a reinstall is a much bigger deal, and because installing it on a whole single partition is the default install option, their default upgrade process is a big deal, and to do that every 6 months is more time consuming than people want. And again, I don't know if there's like enough information for a complete Linux newbie to actually make all these informed decisions of correctly, and what information is more important than other information. But then again, you know, I think I'm really sort of kind of looking for gripes, or at least these are kind of minor gripes. But it would be nice if, because I would like to personally see an install process that was more like Ubuntu's, where you just where you know, you'd get a pop-up saying there's a new version of Linux Mint available, click here to upgrade, and then it gives you a bit of a briefing, it gives you known issues, and then you can choose to upgrade if you feel that it's safe enough, and that would be a great option to upgrade. Obviously Linux Mint consider that to be unstable, and they do take stability really, really seriously, and that is a good reason for not offering that particular upgrade feature. But if you're going to insist, or at least heavily advise people to do a fresh install every time they want to update Linux Mint, then having the home partition on a separate, the home directory on a separate partition as a default install option might be a good idea, might be a good step to move into. But that being said, to install a long-term release as well, so that you don't have to update every 6 months, is a pretty good option for Linux Mint as well, because Linux Mint changes very slowly over time. It's a distribution that evolves. It's not like Ubuntu, where one day the icons are going to be vertical, the next they're going to be horizontal, and next they're going to be, you know, just all over the place. Linux Mint is a very sensible and grounded distribution, again, to its credit. And you can easily get away with installing a long-term support release without missing out on too much, which is great. And again, maybe, you know, I don't know how prominently they put their long-term support releases versus their short-term releases, but again, that might be more accommodating to new people, because again, people who are used to Windows, not used to upgrading very often, and upgrading every 6 months is going to be, you know, a hell of a shock to them. But like I say, all in all, fantastic distribution as always. No surprises, thankfully. And again, it's like I say, it's a distribution that evolves slowly over time, and it's one that we can rely on. And it is a good distribution to rely on because they take stability just really, really seriously. Because, you know, fixing bugs and fixing errors, it's just life's too short for that kind of thing, and the developers of Linux Mint know that, and they certainly set Ubuntu straight on more than a few issues. So anyway, that's just a few thoughts on Linux Mint. I know that I've covered sort of Linux Mint in a wider capacity rather than just Linux Mint 17 here. If you guys want me to check out the Mate version of the distribution, please let me know down in the comments section below, and I'll be more than happy to. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter as well, @ChristopherWare. You can see that little purple thing up there. Whenever I do a live stream, I tend to tell people on Twitter. Sometimes people on YouTube know, but sometimes they don't. So anyway, that's about it for me today. Thank you very, very, very much for watching. And I've been Chris Ware, and you've been awesome. Take care now.